A police officer thought she was arresting just another powerless man on the courthouse steps. She slapped him, shoved him against the wall, and sneered, "You people don't belong here." But minutes later, that same man walked back into the courtroom wearing his judicial robes, because he was the presiding judge of the very courthouse she claimed to protect. What followed would shake an entire justice system to its core. This is the story you can't afford to miss. Stay with me, and if you love powerful true-to-life dramas like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story. It was the kind of cold that chews through wool and patience. Dawn scraped a pale line along the roofline of the Jefferson County Courthouse, making the columns look more like teeth than pillars. Elias Monroe climbed the steps with a leather case hugged close to his ribs, breath fogging in short, careful puffs. He'd slept 3 hours, maybe 4. The briefs inside the case still carried the warm, papery smell of a midnight printer run, the ink barely settled. He told himself the ache behind his eyes was from the coffee, not from the fact that lately he spent more time arguing with shadows than with men. Halfway up the steps, a uniform stepped into his path. "Hold it," the officer said. A woman, compact, athletic, her blonde hair nodded with the confidence of someone who never worried about being late. The name on her tag read Kane. Elias stopped. "Good morning, officer." Her gaze flicked to the case, to his scuffed Oxfords, to the faint line of a neckline seam peeking from beneath his coat. Not a judge's robe, not a bailiff's badge. Just a man in a suit on the wrong side of her suspicion. "Where are you headed?" she asked, chin tilting, the question shaped like a verdict. "Inside," he said. "I have work." "What kind of work?" "The kind that happens in courthouses." He kept his voice even, polite, as if tone could sand down prejudice to something manageable. She didn't smile. "Identification." He shifted the case to his left hand, reached into his coat for his wallet. The move was slow, deliberate, the choreography he'd learned from a lifetime of instructions. Keep your hands visible. Narrate your movements. Leave dignity for later. He was halfway to flipping open the leather when her hand flashed. The slap was not theatrical. It was mechanical, palm cheek, the crisp report of skin striking skin, bouncing off the stone. Pain shot across his jaw. The case slipped, files skidding into a bright paper fan down the steps. A rustle, a gasp from somewhere near the doors. His eyes watered involuntarily, not from shame. Not yet, just the body's plain surprise at violence. Officer Kane stepped closer. She smelled faintly of peppermint and duty station coffee. "You people never learn," she said, low enough that a camera could miss it, clear enough that a conscience could not. Elias swallowed copper. "You're making a mistake." "Am I?" Her forearm pressed into his collarbone, pinning him to the cold stone between 2 Doric columns. 2 more. Uniforms drifted into frame with the casual curiosity of dogs meeting at a fence. Rodriguez and Lively, if his quick glance read right. Phones angled, shoulders relaxed, no urgency. "No threat here but the one wearing the badge." "Hands behind your back," Kane said. He complied. The cuffs bit the tender skin, the click as punctuational as a gavel. Papers slid past the toe of his shoe, exhibits, motions, color tabs like confetti scattered in the wind. His case slid, thumped, came to rest against the base of Lady Justice. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so useful. "Look at that," Rodriguez said, nudging a file with his boot. "Legal documents, stolen probably. Or printed at 3 a.m. by a man who can't stop believing systems can be repaired." Elias murmured before he could stop himself. Kane leaned in. "What was that?" "Nothing." He lifted his eyes over her shoulder, past the circle of uniforms and the delighted phones, to the bronze plaque set into the stone above the doors. "Justice for all," it said. No footnotes, no qualifiers. The words steadied something in him, even as his wrists burned. He let the sting become a focus. The way runners lean into cramps until pain becomes a kind of tempo. Walk, Kane ordered. They walked. Inside, the courthouse breathed its weekday breath coffee. Steam, copier ozone, the tart whisper of floor polish. The fluorescent lights buzzed gently, as if embarrassed by everything they illuminated. Kane kept one hand on his elbow, steering. People glanced up and quickly away, the choreography of second-hand guilt. A clerk with a dotted blouse folded, her hands over her keyboard, as if prayer might disguise staring. A young bailiff with a baby scar on his jawline flinched when he saw Elias's face, then schooled his expression into blandness. Elias caught the flinch and filed it away. People who still flinched could still be reached. In courtroom 2B, the air felt colder. Temporary Judge Whitmore, 70-ish, chin like a punctuation mark, hair that had given up and gone home, sat where the seal said someone should. He adjusted his glasses in quick, nervous twitches, the small movements of a man who prefers file rooms to fireworks. Kane smoothed her uniform like a curtain. The phone she'd used on the steps had vanished. Her shoulders rounded into the posture of a public servant. When she spoke, her voice was freshly ironed. "Your Honor," she began. This individual was loitering near a restricted entrance. He refused to provide identification and became verbally aggressive when asked to comply with standard security protocols. Based on his behavior and the possession of what appeared to be stolen legal documents, I moved to detain him. He resisted. The syllables clicked into place like assembly line parts. Elias stood at the defense table, cuffs biting, the bruise flowering along his cheekbone. He watched Whitmore's gaze shuttle between uniform and defendant, watched the tiny economy of credibility unfold. The uniform got compound interest. The defendant paid hidden fees. "Very well," Whitmore said. "And the injuries?" "Self-inflicted," Kane said smoothly. He stumbled. "I used only the minimum force necessary." Rodriguez nodded solemnly. Lively examined the spot on the wall as if it might confess something. The stenographer's fingers flew. The record kept time. Elias followed the rhythm with his breath. Inhale on accusation, exhale on euphemism, until the room's pulse matched his own. "Defendant," Whitmore said, without looking up, "state your name." "Elias Monroe." "Mr. Monroe, do you have counsel?" "I do," Elias said. "He's late." It was almost true. Counsel was habit, not necessity, but the lie wasn't meant to buy sympathy. It was meant to buy 30 seconds, and until counsel arrives, Whitmore prompted. "I can answer a few preliminary questions," Elias said, and allowed a calm he'd learned the hard way to rise in his chest. "When you drive mountain roads at night, you learn to let the darkness widen your focus." He stood straight. The cuffs dragged at his wrists, but there are times restraint reads as poise. "Proceed." "First," Elias said, "I was on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance at approximately 8:42 a.m. United States. V. Grace recognizes such sidewalks as traditional public forums. Second, the documents in question are legitimate case files. If the court would like verification, we can request a preservation order for all exterior cameras between 8:35 and 9:05 a.m., as well as automatic body camera backups for any officer on duty in the East Plaza." For the first time, Whitmore looked up. The bailiff, the young one with the jawline scar, stilled, like a deer catching the scent of something familiar. Kane blinked, just once, but it was enough. People who count on darkness do not expect light to come with citations. The body CM malfunctioned, she said quickly. "The backups rarely do," Elias replied. He didn't glance at her when he said it. He addressed the bench, the way a man addresses gravity. "I also request that the court instruct the officers present to preserve any mobile recordings in their possession. Spoliation is not a doctrine with a sense of humor." The stenographer's hands paused for a beat, then resumed. "The machine." Accepting the sentence like a donation. Whitmore fussed with his glasses. It was a tiny fidget that told on him. Judges don't fidget unless something in the room has shifted. Mr. Monroe, are you an attorney? Elias let the question hang just long enough to register. I have some experience with the law, he said. The answer wasn't coy. It was a promise waiting for its proper place. Kane squared her shoulders. Your Honor, this is grandstanding. He was where he shouldn't be with documents he shouldn't have. We can tidy this up with a simple trespass and release him with a warning if, officer, Elias said softly, and the single word reached farther than volume could. You struck me. A hush opened, round and exact. Kane's jaw flexed. I used minimal force. You struck me, he repeated, not to persuade the room, but to anchor himself. Naming injury without begging remedy is a style of power. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the seal on the wall. Whitmore cleared his throat. We will recess for 15 minutes while I consider the defendant's requests. Bailiff, escort Mr. Monroe to holding. Officers, do not leave the building. If there is relevant footage, this court will view it. The gavel's tap was almost apologetic. Chairs scraped. Paper rustled like dry leaves. The bailiff approached. Hands careful, eyes a fraction too wide. This way, sir, he murmured. Elias nodded and allowed himself to be led. As they reached the door, the bailiff leaned, breath a whisper against the clatter of the room. I think I know you, he said, voice trembling on the edge of recognition. Elias said nothing. There are doors that open better if you let someone else turn the knob. Down the corridor, the holding room waited. A box with a bench and a steel table where nerves go to choreograph their next move. The door shut behind them. With a sound like certainty, the bailiff's hands shook as he fumbled with the key. The tremor wasn't fear, Elias realized. It was relief trying to find a way out of the body that had stored it. He turned, met the young man's eyes, and for the first time all morning, allowed a thin smile. Bring me the garment bag from Chambers 3, Elias said quietly. And the wooden box on the credenza. The bailiff swallowed. Yes, your H. He stopped himself, throat jumping. Elias lowered himself onto the bench, wrists still cuffed, jaw still aching, and watched a sliver of winter light crawl across the concrete floor. Beyond the room, the courthouse thrummed, with its usual traffic of paperwork and privilege. Inside the room, time slowed enough for truth to put on its shoes. 15 minutes can redraw a map. If you know where the borders really are. The holding room was narrow, its walls painted the color of aspirin. A single barred window leaked in a reluctant beam of light that barely reached the floor. Elias sat on the bench, wrists still cuffed, though the metal no longer felt like restraint. They felt like punctuation marks, commas in a sentence he was about to finish. The young bailiff lingered near the door, keys trembling in his palm. His nameplate read Henderson. Elias had seen him before in passing, on mornings when he entered. Through the side entrance reserved for judges. The boy's eyes had always carried the half-nervous respect of someone new to the system. Someone not yet hardened by routine. Sir, Henderson whispered now, voice cracking against the silence. Are you who I think you are? Elias didn't answer at first. He let the weight of the question hover, let the silence gather dignity. Then, slowly, he lifted his cuffed hands and rested them on his lap. Bring me the garment bag in Chambers 3 and the wooden box beside it. You know the one. The bailiff's face paled. Recognition bloomed like dawn, spreading across his features. God, he breathed. Judge Monroe. He dropped his voice lower, as if the walls themselves might testify against him. They dragged you in here like a suspect. Elias inclined his head, not with pride, not with shame, with inevitability. Do as I asked. Henderson nodded so hard his hair fell into his eyes. He shoved the keys back into his belt and slipped out, shutting the door softly behind him. Alone, Elias leaned back against the cold cinder block. His cheek throbbed from Kane's slap, each pulse a reminder. He let the pain focus him like a lens. This wasn't the first time violence had been dressed as authority. But it might be the last time Kane or anyone like her got to tell the story uninterrupted. 15 minutes later, the door swung open with a rush of air, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Henderson entered, arms straining with a black garment bag and a polished wooden box. He set them on the steel table with reverence, like offerings at an altar. Elias stood. Henderson's hands shook as he fumbled with the cuffs, finally freeing the judge's wrists. The metal clattered to the floor, the sound sharp, liberating. From the garment bag, Elias drew out the robe. Black fabric, heavy with years, edged with a subtle silver trim that caught the faint light. As he slipped it over his shoulders, his posture straightened, the weight of humiliation dissolving into the gravity of authority. The wooden box clicked open to reveal a gavel. Dark oak, its handle engraved. Justice is blind, but she sees all. Elias lifted it, feeling the familiar balance in his hand. The wood was warm, alive with memory swearing-ins, verdicts, moments when law had bent toward justice, however briefly. Henderson stepped back, his throat tight. "Your Honor," he whispered, "I didn't recognize you without the robe." "You weren't meant to," Elias said, fastening the robe's collar. His voice was calm, but underneath it ran a current of steel. "People like Officer Kane depend on that. They see only what they want to see, a body, a color, a story they've told themselves 100 times. Henderson swallowed hard. "What will you do?" Elias studied his own reflection in the polished metal surface of the table. The bruise on his cheek stood out against the black fabric, an emblem, not a wound. "I will do what I've always done," he said. "Hold court." Transition, back to the courtroom. When the recess ended, murmurs filled courtroom 2B like restless wind. Rodriguez and Lively leaned near the prosecution table, exchanging smirks. Kane adjusted her holster, ready to resume her well-worn script. Judge Whitmore sat with the unease of a man who sensed the stage had shifted, but hadn't read the new play. Then the bailiff's voice rang out, booming with authority it had never carried before. "All rise." The gallery stood, some reluctantly, others with a reflex born of habit. Whitmore frowned, confused, as Henderson continued, his voice stronger now. The Honorable Judge Elias Monroe presiding. The chamber froze. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Kane's face drained of color. The side door opened, and Elias entered, not as the man in cuffs, not as the defendant, but cloaked in the authority that had always been his. The robe's hem brushed the marble floor. The gavel rested in his hand like a verdict already decided. He walked with measured steps, the silence thickening with every footfall. Whitmore scrambled to his feet, his glasses sliding down his nose. I didn't realize. You managed my courtroom during my absence," Elias said evenly, ascending the bench. "You may return to your docket now." Whitmore gathered his files like a man fleeing a fire. Muttering apologies as he nearly tripped on his way out, Elias took his rightful seat, set the gavel on the bench before him, and looked directly at Kane. The bruise on his cheek burned, but his eyes were steady, cutting through her like sunlight through fog. "Officer Kane," he said, his voice calm, resonant, final. "You may remain standing." Her knees trembled. The gallery held its breath. The stage was reset. The roles had reversed. And justice was ready to speak. The courtroom was a tomb of silence, the kind that hummed with the weight of anticipation. Elias Monroe sat high on the bench, his robe draping like midnight over stone. The gavel rested before him, but he didn't touch it yet. He let the silence stretch, taut as a wire, forcing every eye in the chamber to remain fixed on him. Officer Kane stood rigid, hands clasped behind her back, her jaw set in a mask of control that was beginning to crack at the edges. Rodriguez and Lively lingered near the prosecutor's table, their boots shifting against the marble floor, searching for exits that no longer existed. Elias leaned forward slightly. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate, each word cutting through the silence like a chisel into stone. "Officer Kane," he began, "do you recall your sworn testimony from earlier this morning?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, though her voice wavered. "You testified that I—" Elias allowed the briefest pause, his eyes locking with hers. "Was loitering near a restricted entrance, that I refused to provide identification, and that I became verbally aggressive." "Is that accurate?" Kane swallowed. "Yes, sir." Elias tapped the screen of a tablet resting on the bench. A moment later, the wall-mounted monitor flickered to life. The gallery shifted as heads craned, breath hitched, eyes widened. The video began to play. The exterior steps filled the screen. Elias in his civilian suit, leather case in hand, ascending toward the courthouse doors. And then there she was, Rebecca Kane, stepping into his path. Her voice rang out, crystal clear, carried by the high-definition microphones embedded in the security system. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" Gasps erupted in the gallery. Someone muttered, "Jesus." Another whispered, "She said that?" Elias's own voice played, calm, polite, inside. "I have work." Then came the moment, the slap sharp and merciless, the crack echoing even through the speakers. Papers flying, Elias's body slammed against the wall. Kane's sneer, "You people don't belong here." The courtroom watched in horrified silence. The judge on the bench was no longer speaking. They were hearing him as a victim. The distance between the robed figure and the man in the video collapsed, and the truth became undeniable. Elias pressed pause. The frozen image of Kane's hand on his throat filled the screen. "Officer Kane," he said quietly, "do you see any aggression from me in this footage? Any profanity? Any refusal to comply?" Kane opened her mouth, but the words stuck like fishbones. "Your Honor, the angle." "Angles do not invent slurs," Elias interrupted. His tone was gentle, but the rebuke struck harder than a shout. He tapped again. A second video appeared, this time from the body cam attached to Kane's chest. She had claimed it malfunctioned, but the county's backup system had saved every second. The footage was damning. Kane's voice, snarling, "Time to teach this one his place." The camera shook as she shoved Elias against the stone wall. Her laughter joined with Rodriguez's off-screen chuckle. Rodriguez's own voice came through. "Legal documents, huh? Bet he stole them." Lively's laugh followed. Probably another welfare rat trying to play smart. The gallery erupted, not in applause, not yet, but in gasps, whispers, the shuffle of outrage being born. Elias turned from the monitor and fixed his gaze on Rodriguez and Lively. "Officers," he said, "you both testified under oath that—" "I resisted, that Officer Kane handled the situation with professionalism. Do you wish to revise that testimony?" Neither man moved. Rodriguez shifted toward the door, but Henderson, the young bailiff, was already standing there, arms folded. "No one leaves," Elias said simply. "Not until this record is complete." Rodriguez sat back down, his face pale. Elias let the silence settle once more, then turned his attention back to Kane. "Officer Kane, in this courtroom, you swore to tell the truth. You presented lies as fact, prejudice as law. You did not know whom you struck this morning, but that is irrelevant. Because justice does not depend on titles. Justice depends on truth." Kane's shoulders slumped, but Elias did not relent. Picked up the gavel, its weight steady in his hand. He did not strike it yet. Instead, he gestured toward the projection of her words, her actions, immortalized in the footage. "This," he said, voice low but carrying to the farthest corner, "is what you called professionalism. This is what you called minimum force. This is what you swore was justice." The words rippled across the room, breaking whatever illusions remained. The gallery was no longer a passive audience. They leaned forward, eyes blazing, hungry for what came next. Elias placed the gavel back down with care. "We are not finished," he said. "Because what this court has witnessed today is not only the violence of one officer, it is the silence of many. And silence, too, has consequences." The transition was complete. From victim to judge, from silence to voice, from accusation to proof, the battle had shifted. And for the first time that morning, justice was not just promised. It was visible. The footage faded to black, leaving the courtroom in a silence that felt carved from stone. Every ear rang with Cain's voice. Every eye still saw her hand at Elias's throat. The officer herself stood rigid, but her uniform looked less like armor now and more like a costume that no longer fit. Elias let the quiet hang. He understood silence, how it could wound deeper than words, how it could build pressure until truth cracked through. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of steel. "Officer Cain," he said, "you asked this court to believe your story over mine. You thought a uniform could outweigh the truth. But justice does not live in fabric or badges, it lives in records." He lifted a thick manila folder from the bench. The paper inside bulged, edges worn from long use. The sight of it alone made Cain flinch. "This file," Elias continued, "contains every complaint filed against you in the past 15 years, 49 in total. 49 citizens who alleged misconduct, abuse, intimidation. 49. Voices ignored, their testimonies dismissed as unsubstantiated." A murmur rolled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching like flint. "Let's begin," Elias said, opening the folder. Complaint number 1. A shopkeeper, Mr. Daniel Cruz, age 62. He alleged you slammed his head against a freezer door during a routine license inspection. Internal Affairs found his claim inconclusive. He turned a page. Complaint number 12. A 17-year-old honor student, Marcus Bell. He alleged you searched him without cause, planted contraband in his backpack, and called him a street rat. Internal Affairs again. Unsubstantiated. Cain's lips parted, but no words came. Page after page, Elias read. A mother pulled from her car at gunpoint, with her toddler screaming in the back seat. A physician arrested outside his own home because Cain insisted he didn't look like someone who belonged there. A grandmother bruised her during the traffic stop when she dared to ask for a badge number. With each account, the courtroom shifted, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. Complaint 34. Elias said, his tone cutting sharper. A 28-year-old man named Anthony Green. He alleged you handcuffed him outside this very courthouse, threw him against a wall, and told him, Elias's eyes lifted, spearing Cain's, that he belonged in a cage. Almost word for word what you told me this morning. Gasps spread. Someone in the gallery muttered, pattern. Elias snapped the folder shut with a sound like judgment itself. You see, Officer Cain, the violence of the day was not an accident. It was not an isolated lapse of judgment. It was the natural product of a career built on lies, shielded by silence, protected by a system too comfortable to confront its own rot. He let that word rot linger. Rodriguez shifted in his seat, sweat slicking his brow. Lively stared at the floor, as if the marble might swallow him. Elias turned his gaze to them. And you, he said. You stood in this courtroom and swore under oath that Officer Cain handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Do you wish to amend that statement? Neither man moved. Very well, Elias said, reaching for another folder. Because this court has more than testimony. It has statistics. He laid out a chart on the easel beside the bench. Each bar, a block of color stabbing upward. Over your 15-year career, Officer Cain, 84% of your arrests involved people of color. Yet this county is less than 40%. Minority, explain that disparity. Cain's mouth opened, closed. Your use of force reports show physical force in 61% of those arrests, compared to 11% involving white suspects. Explain that too. Silence. And of your 1,000 plus arrests, more than 400 cases were dismissed, Officer Kane, because of insufficient evidence, unconstitutional searches, or misconduct. Elias's hand slammed flat against the easel, the sound reverberating through the chamber. That is not policing, that is criminality dressed in blue. The gallery erupted in whispers, outrage threading through every row. One reporter whispered to another, "This is historic. This is systemic exposure in open court." Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing on Kane. "Do you recall what you told me this morning when you shoved me against the wall?" Her face blanched. "You said I needed to learn my place," Elias continued. His voice dropped lower, forcing the entire room to strain to hear. "But the only lesson taught today is yours. And it is written not in your words, but in your record, a record of rot." Kane trembled, her hands twitching at her sides. She looked like a puppet whose strings had suddenly been cut. Elias picked up the gavel, holding it upright, the engraved words glinting in the overhead light. "Actions," he said, "have consequences." The phrase echoed back the very words Kane had once used as justification. Now they boomeranged, weighted with finality. He struck the gavel once. The sharp crack rang like thunder through the chamber. "This court," Elias declared, "recognizes probable cause for charges of felony, assault, perjury, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Officer Rebecca Kane, you are hereby remanded to federal custody pending trial." Gasps turned to cries. Reporters surged forward. Henderson stepped smartly to Kane's side, no longer trembling, his hand firm on her shoulder as he removed the badge from her chest. The uniform had become a costume again, one she could no longer wear. Elias sat back, the gavel still warm in his hand. His cheek still throbbed, but the bruise had become something else entirely. Not a mark of victimhood, but a seal of truth. And though the climax of this morning had arrived, Elias knew the story was far from over. Because this wasn't just about Kane. It was about every officer who had laughed, every supervisor who had looked away, every citizen told their pain was unsubstantiated. The reckoning had only begun. The bailiff's voice carried above the chaos. "Court is in recess." But his words were swallowed by the storm. Reporters surged forward like waves against a seawall. Attorneys huddled, whispering, their eyes darting between Elias on the bench and Rebecca Kane, now pale and cuffed in her own uniform. Rodriguez and Lively shrank against the prosecutor's table, their faces slick with sweat. They had come into this courtroom confident, rehearsed, armed with the same script they had performed for years. Now they looked like schoolboys caught copying an exam, every lie tattooed on the record. Kane herself stood hollow-eyed, wrists bound, the badge that once commanded fear now sitting in Henderson's palm. He held it not with pride, but with the caution of someone handling a live wire finely cut from its source. Elias remained seated, unmoving. His gavel rested quietly on the bench, but its echo still lived in the walls, vibrating through the bones. Of everyone present, he did not need to speak. His silence said enough. The roles had shifted, permanently. By the time Kane was escorted from the chamber, escorted not as an officer, but as a defendant, whispers had already grown into roars in the hallways. Court clerks abandoned their desks to peek through doors. Attorneys on other cases slipped into the gallery. Even janitors, mop buckets forgotten, clustered near the walls. "Did you hear? Officer Kane cuffed in open court. They say the judge she assaulted was the Judge Monroe himself. Security footage, body cam backups, it's all real." News travels fast in courthouses. Faster than law, faster than reason. By the time Kane was booked into the holding cell 2 floors below, phones across the city buzzed with headlines. Officer arrested after assaulting sitting judge. When the courtroom calmed, Elias stood from the bench. His robe draped heavy, his bruise livid against his skin. He didn't need a script. His entire career had been rehearsal for this moment. Today is not about me, he began, voice steady. It is not even about one officer. What you witnessed this morning is the culmination of years, decades, of silence, of complaints dismissed, of truth buried. This courtroom is where the law is supposed to live. But too often it has been a place where justice comes to die. He let the words settle, not with anger, but with weary conviction. Rebecca Kane is not the first officer to abuse her power. She is only the first to do it on record against someone the system could not ignore. That should haunt us. Because for every judge with a robe to reveal, there are thousands of citizens without one, citizens who deserved the same justice, but never received it. The gallery leaned forward, caught in the gravity of his words. Even the stenographers' fingers faltered for a heartbeat, overwhelmed. In the prosecutor's row, Sandra Miller, assigned to the state's case docket for years, looked stricken. She'd nodded along to officers' stories more times than she cared to count. She glanced at Rodriguez, at Lively, at the trembling badge in Henderson's hands, and for the first time, she saw not law enforcement, but conspirators. She whispered to her assistant, "We need to reopen every case she touched." Everyone. Behind her, the young law clerk who had frowned earlier was now scribbling furiously, notes spilling across the page. She was already shaping the opening brief of something larger. A systemic review, a reckoning. Hours later, in the administrative wing of the courthouse, phones rang without pause. The chief judge of the district demanded transcripts. The Attorney General's office scheduled emergency calls. Federal investigators already probing quietly into misconduct in the department moved Kane's name to the top of their lists. By sunset, an emergency press conference was announced. The mayor's office issued a terse statement. No one is above the law. Today proves accountability applies to all. But the city knew better. This wasn't proof of accountability. This was proof of luck that the man Kane chose to brutalize carried authority in his pocket. The true question was whether justice would spread beyond this one case. When the courtroom finally emptied, Elias sat alone on the bench. The robe lay heavy around his shoulders, the gavel warm in his palm. His cheek still throbbed, but he welcomed. The ache had kept him grounded in the reality of the morning. He thought of the grandmother shoved into her own car hood. The honor student accused of carrying drugs that weren't his. The physician humiliated outside his own home. All the voices dismissed as unsubstantiated. He whispered into the empty chamber, more prayer than speech. "This is for you." The words were quiet, but the silence answered. By evening, the footage was everywhere, broadcast on television, dissected on social media, replayed in living rooms and cafes. The slap, the choke, the words, "You people don't belong here," played on loop, stripped of excuse, undeniable. Comments poured in. She thought he was powerless. She thought wrong. This isn't just about him. It's about all of us. Finally, someone with authority stood up and said enough. The video of Elias returning to the bench in his robe became iconic, shared millions of times. Memes appeared within hours. Justice in robes, justice with a bruise, justice with a gavel. The next morning, newspapers carried a headline in bold type, "The Judge Who Fought Back." Beneath it, an image. Elias, gavel raised, bruise blooming. Eyes steady. Inside precincts across the city, officers read the story with unease. Some muttered about betrayal, about being thrown to the wolves. Others sat in quiet, their silence different now, less complicit, more afraid. In community centers, pastors and activists held up the newspaper and asked, "If justice can defend itself, why can't it defend us?" And in homes where mothers had once told their children not to expect fairness, hope flickered like a fragile candle. Elias knew this was only the beginning. Kane was in custody, yes. But the disease ran deeper into every report she filed. Every testimony Rodriguez and Lively had rehearsed. Every prosecutor who had nodded along instead of asking questions. He closed the folder of complaints and looked out at the empty courtroom. The plaque above the doors, "Justice for All," gleamed faintly in the last light of day. Tomorrow, the real trial would begin. Not of Rebecca Kane, but of the system itself. The courthouse never really slept, but that night it did not breathe. Its walls seemed to hum with the residue of the morning's upheaval, as if the building itself had been jarred awake. Reporters lingered on the steps long after dark, their camera lights casting restless shadows across the columns. Citizens gathered in small knots along the sidewalks, trading theories, replaying grainy phone clips of the moment Elias Monroe reclaimed his bench. But the real shockwaves traveled farther than Marble and Street. By midnight, Washington had called. At the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division had been keeping quiet tabs on Jefferson County for months. Kane's name was familiar to them, a recurring figure in complaint files that never reached daylight. But now they had something unprecedented, not only footage, but a federal judge as witness and victim. The call to Elias came near dawn. Voice on the line was measured, formal, but he could hear the tremor of urgency beneath. "Judge Monroe, will be dispatching a joint task force effective immediately. We're treating this as a civil rights violation under color of law. And more than that, we're expanding the scope." "How far?" Elias asked, his cheek still aching, his robe still draped across the chair where he'd left it. "Every case Kane touched in the last decade. Every officer who corroborated her reports. Every supervisor who signed off. We're pulling the thread." Elias closed his eyes. He had waited 23 years on the bench to hear those words. Then, pull it until the whole garment comes apart. Within a week, the courthouse archives were stripped open like old wounds. Boxes of transcripts, dismissed complaints, faded arrest records, once left to gather dust, were hauled into conference rooms where federal attorneys and investigators spread them across long tables. Patterns emerged quickly. Arrest narratives. Repeated almost word for word. The defendant became verbally aggressive, refused to comply, threatened officer safety. Entire paragraphs cloned across dozens of cases. And the names, so many names. Anthony Green, whose complaint about being cuffed and told he belonged in a cage had been dismissed. Rosa Delgado, 63, bruised during a traffic stop. Marcus Bell, 17, whose scholarship had evaporated after a drug arrest now revealed as fabricated. Each file was more than paper. Each was a life bent out of shape by the same script. Investigators contacted victims. Some were wary, scarred by years of disbelief. Others wept on the phone, voices cracking with a relief they had thought impossible. "You mean someone finally listened?" One man asked. Rodriguez and Lively were summoned under subpoena within days. Their swagger dissolved in sterile federal offices, under the fluorescent glare of cameras they could not switch off. Lively cracked first, sweat staining his collar. We just went along." Kane ran the playbook. "We backed her up. Everybody did." "Everybody?" The investigator pressed. Supervisors, prosecutors looked the other way. "We all knew the body cams had backups, but nobody checked." "They didn't want to check." Rodriguez tried to hold the line, but when shown transcripts of his own words caught on Kane's body cam mocking, complicit his silence was its own confession. Both men were indicted for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. And the department that had once protected them scrambled to explain why 3 officers with dozens of complaints were still wearing uniforms. On Jefferson's East Side, where families had long since stopped calling the police, except in the direst emergencies, the news spread like fire. Community centers filled with residents holding copies of reopened cases. Local pastors read names from pulpits, those jailed, those scarred, those buried under false charges. "They told us our pain was unsubstantiated," one mother said. standing before a microphone at a rally. But today, the record itself has substantiated it. Crowds roared, not with celebration, but with long-delayed release. The mayor, under pressure, announced the department would be placed under federal oversight. "This is about trust," she said into the cameras. And trust has been broken. But in living rooms and barber shops, citizens shook their heads. Trust wasn't broken, they said. It was stolen. And now maybe we're getting it back. Elias watched the storm from chambers that suddenly felt too small. His bruise had yellowed, but the memory of Cain's hand on his throat lingered as vividly as the first sting. He fielded calls from law schools inviting him to speak, from national networks wanting interviews. He declined most of them. This wasn't about becoming a symbol. Symbols could be admired and forgotten. He wanted something else. Permanence. One evening, alone in his office, he reread the engraving on his gavel. Justice is blind, but she sees all. He traced the letters with his thumb. How many times had he lifted this gavel, believing the system beneath it was intact? How many times had Cain testified in his very courtroom while truth sat strangled in the shadows? He told himself this reckoning must not stop with her, or with Rodriguez, or Lively, or even this department. It had to go further into the marrow of the system itself. 2 weeks later, the DOJ announced the formation of a National Commission on Systemic Police Misconduct, citing the Jefferson Courthouse precedent as the catalyst. Across the country, citizens replayed the video of Elias walking back into his own courtroom in robes. The bruise still fresh. It was shared not as entertainment, but as evidence, proof that authority could be challenged, proof that lies could unravel, proof that power could be made to answer. In classrooms, civics teachers showed the footage to teenagers who had only known stories of impunity. In those moments, belief in justice flickered back to life. Yet Elias knew victory came with cost. His inbox filled with threats, some anonymous, some signed brazenly. "You betrayed the badge," one email read. Others promised vengeance. Hired no security. He walked the same sidewalks each morning, bruise faded but visible in the public's memory. He carried himself with the same calm he had in the courtroom. Fear was real, but so was resolve. At night, he thought of his father, a man who had once told him that justice was like a river. It could be diverted, dammed, polluted, but it always sought the sea. Maybe this moment was the river breaking through. In the courthouse plaza, a bronze plaque was installed where the assault had first occurred. It read simply, "Here, a judge stood not only for himself but for all who had been silenced." Justice began. Again on these steps, visitors stopped to read it, touching the letters like scripture. Some left flowers. Others left court summonses, citations, photographs of loved ones lost to the system. The steps became less a threshold and more a shrine. And still, Elias rose each morning, donned his robe, and took his bench. Because this reckoning was not a moment. It was a beginning. The Jefferson Courthouse saga should have ended within county lines. Another local scandal burned hot, then forgotten. But it did not. The video of Elias Monroe reclaiming his bench spread like wildfire, carried not by news anchors alone, but by ordinary people who saw in his bruise the echo of their own stories. By the third week, the judge who fought back had become shorthand across the nation. Protest banners carried his silhouette, robes flowing, gavel raised. Hashtags trended daily, amplifying voices long ignored. Elias had never sought the role of icon. Yet when he walked into his courtroom each morning, he now found reporters stationed outside, cameras flashing as though each step he took was evidence of endurance. Strangers mailed him letters. "You spoke for my son, who never got a chance to defend himself. Thank you for proving we're not crazy when we say the system is broken." In Atlanta, students organized justice in robes marchers, wearing thrift store graduation gowns as stand-ins for judicial robes. In Los Angeles, A mural appeared overnight on the site of a community center. Elias's face, bruise unsoftened, eyes steady, the words "Justice sees all" painted in crimson beneath. The message was no longer local. It was national. Congress could not ignore the groundswell. Hearings were convened. Elias was summoned to testify before the House Judiciary Committee. He declined at first. Judges rarely stepped into political arenas, but when pressed, he agreed, insisting he would speak not as a politician, but as a witness. The chamber was packed the day he arrived in D.C. Senators leaned forward as he described, in the same calm cadence he had used in court, how a uniformed officer turned truth into theater, how colleagues echoed the script, how the system rewarded the lie until it touched someone it could not afford to silence. "This is not about my bruise," he told them. "It is about every bruise you never saw. It is about the invisible wounds carried by citizens whose complaints you dismissed as statistical noise. If you do nothing more than treat my case as anomaly, then you have missed the point entirely." The room fell silent. Even partisan lines blurred in the weight of his words. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Police unions staged rallies branding Elias as anti-cop, accusing him of tarnishing honorable service with isolated misconduct. Talk radio hosts called him an opportunist. One commentator sneered, he just wanted to be a celebrity judge. Threats escalated. Anonymous letters, phone calls in the night, online screeds promising revenge. One morning, a bullet casing was found outside his chambers, polished, waiting like a calling card. But for every threat, tenfold support arrived: flowers, handwritten prayers, scholarships raised in his name for students studying law. The scales, for once, tipped in favor of hope. The DOJ's task force widened. Within 6 months, 5 other departments in neighboring counties were placed under review. Body camera systems were upgraded nationwide, with mandatory cloud backups. Immune to tampering. In Jefferson County alone, more than 300 convictions linked to Kane and her circle were vacated. Men and women walked free after years in prison. The courthouse steps became a place of reunion, families clutching one another, tears soaking into the same marble where Elias's papers had once scattered. Federal oversight mandated that complaint review boards include civilian members. For the first time, ordinary citizens had a seat at the table. And in law schools across the country, Elias's testimony was woven into curriculum not as legend, but as case study, how systemic rot can hide in plain sight, and how one moment of exposure can shift the tide. Elias remained reluctant. He continued his docket, ruling on contract disputes, criminal hearings, family petitions. He refused book deals, turned down speaking tours, but he could not turn down the quiet moments. When citizens stopped him on sidewalks, a mother clutching her child's hand whispered, "Thank you for reminding me to believe again." An exonerated man pressed Elias's hand and said, "You gave me my name back." These were the encounters that mattered, the small, raw confirmations. That justice was not an abstraction but a living exchange between people. News programs began calling it the Monroe Moment. Some predicted it would fade. But the deeper truth was harder to erase. The sight of a judge, bruised but unbowed, wielding the law against those who had corrupted it. Op-eds framed it as a reminder that accountability must reach every corner of power. Churches preached it as parable. Even justice wears a face, and sometimes that face must stand bruised before the world. And in high schools, teenagers debated careers in law, inspired not by Perry Mason reruns, but by Elias Monroe living, breathing. Proof that one voice, amplified by truth, could ripple outward until an entire nation shifted its gaze. Late one evening, Elias walked past the bronze plaque on the courthouse steps. Citizens had left candles, notes, photographs of loved ones harmed by the system. He paused, touched the cold letters. Here, justice stood its ground. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel weary. But then he straightened, the robe around his shoulders heavy, steady. reminding him that symbols fade if they do not keep walking. The nation had turned his bruise into a movement, but for Elias, it was simpler. Tomorrow there would be another docket, another case, another chance to prove that justice, however battered, was still alive. And sometimes, that was enough. 10 years later, the Jefferson County Courthouse no longer looked the same. The columns still rose white and solemn against the skyline, but the steps had changed. They were no longer just an entryway for lawyers and litigants. They had become a living memorial. The bronze plaque that once marked the site of Elias Monroe's assault had grown into a plaza of remembrance. Around it, citizens had laid bricks engraved with names, thousands of them. Names of men and women once silenced, once dismissed as unsubstantiated. Names of the exonerated, the vindicated, the forgotten. Children played between the stones, their laughter mingling with the solemnity. It was no longer a place of shame. It was a place of reclamation. Elias himself now walked slower, his robe lighter across his shoulders. Retirement had freed him from the daily rhythm of dockets and motions, but the world had not released him entirely. He was invited constantly to universities, to panels, to ceremonies. Law students whispered his name as if it carried the weight of case law, yet he resisted being mythologized. "I am not justice," he told them gently. "I was simply present when justice demanded a witness." Still, his story had woven itself into the American fabric. The footage of his return to the bench was replayed every year on the anniversary, taught in classrooms alongside landmark rulings. The phrase "the Monroe moment" had entered the lexicon, shorthand for the instant truth could no longer be denied. The reforms that followed remained imperfect, but they were real. Civilian review boards were now standard across the country. Federal oversight programs had teeth. Body camera footage was preserved in redundant systems that no officer could malfunction away. More importantly, communities had found their voices. Citizens once too weary to file complaints now did so with expectation rather than futility. Young lawyers entered the field not to join firms but to fight civil rights cases. Judges themselves, emboldened by Monroe's example, grew less tolerant of vague police reports and rehearsed testimonies. The tide had not turned completely. Corruption remained, injustice endured, but the ground beneath had shifted. The silence was broken. One autumn afternoon, Elias returned quietly to the courthouse steps. He carried no robe, no gavel, only a small bouquet of wildflowers. He placed them at the base of the plaque, beside dozens of other offerings. As he stood, a young man approached hesitantly. He was tall, his suit too new, his tie slightly askew. "Judge Monroe?" Elias nodded. "My name's Marcus Bell," the young man said softly. "You probably don't remember, but I was the kid Kane arrested when I was 17. Said I had drugs. I didn't." His voice wavered, then steadied. "They vacated my record after the task force. I got into law school. I'm clerking now." Elias felt the years fold in on themselves, memory and present colliding. "Marcus," he said, voice thick, "I do remember. And I am glad you're here." The young man smiled, eyes shining. "I just wanted to say, thank you. You gave me back my future." Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said, "you reclaimed it yourself. All I did was open the door." Across the country, institutions bore his name now. The Monroe Institute for Judicial Integrity, scholarships for students in civil rights law, even training programs for police academies that began each session with a simple reminder: justice is not yours to control. It is yours to serve. In Jefferson, the courthouse itself had been renamed the Monroe Justice Center. Tourists visited not to gawk at scandal, but to witness where the tide had shifted. Guides told the story with reverence, how a judge, mistaken for a powerless man, had exposed the rot and demanded accountability. In his home, Far from the cameras, Elias kept the robe folded neatly in a cedar chest. The gavel, engraved with "Justice is blind, but she sees all," rested on his desk. He no longer raised it in judgment, but he touched it often, as one touches a relic. Sometimes late at night, he replayed the video not of Cain's violence, but of his walk back into the courtroom. He studied his own face, bruised but composed, and wondered if that moment had belonged to him at all, or if he had simply been chosen by history, a vessel through which justice demanded to be seen years after his death. The story remained. Teachers told it to children as proof that courage could wear a robe as easily as it wore protest banners. Activists invoked his name as reminder that silence could be shattered. And every time a citizen stood against power, insisting on truth, someone would whisper, "Another Monroe moment." Because in the end, Elias Monroe's true legacy was not a verdict or a sentence. It was the simple, enduring truth that justice, however delayed, could rise again, bruised, battered, but unbroken. And sometimes, when history demanded, justice hit back. Officer Cain thought justice was blind. She was wrong. Justice saw her, judged her, and struck back. And from that day forward, every citizen who had been silenced finally had a voice. Remember this: power without accountability will always crumble when truth is revealed. If this story moved you, share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of courage and redemption are coming your way. Together, we'll keep the light of justice alive.